Dragon Quest is an incredibly well-known series of games made by Square Enix. In fact, it's one of the most recognizable game series in Japan, even more popular than Final Fantasy. Despite the fact that the franchise is nearly 36 years old at the time that I write this, it's still one of the most anticipated games every year it is revealed to have a sequel or a spin-off. Why is that? In fact, I want to know why most sequels have more hype than the last game. The franchise, which had its first game released in 1986, was the love child of various legendary Japanese creators that became known as Chunsoft. It was always meant to be a hugely popular and well-known game franchise. The artist of all these games has been Akira Toriyama, who is also well known for his work on Dragon Ball and Chrono Trigger. At the time, Toriyama had just had the first episode of the now incredibly well-known anime and manga Dragon Ball. So as an artist, he'd already established himself since in the 80s it was a bit harder to get your show animated. The composer was Koichi Sugiyama, who recently passed away, rest his soul, and who was one of the most well-known Japanese composers in the gaming industry at the time. He'd worked in Enix for 4 to 5 years by the time the game came out, and was chosen to lead the music. There are more well-known people involved in the development, such as Koichi Nakamura, but I'm going on an unnecessary tangent. Most places that talk about the success of Dragon Quest already discuss these creators and what they did for the success of the series. Rather than talk about that, I want to discuss why the third game was such a massive hit compared to the relatively okay success of the first two games. And I want to do it through this idea called motivation. So what is motivation? That's a stupid question. Obviously, it just means something that pushes you in a direction. Now, technically that isn't an incorrect definition, but it's an incredibly oversimplified version of the theory of motivation. Motivation is a psychological field about why and how one acts under any set of circumstances. It allows us to dissect why some events tend to maintain people's interests throughout a desired period of time, which will be very useful in answering the question we're asking. The classical way in which psychologists analyze motivation nowadays is through self-determination theory. This theory bases itself on 3 basic principles, which led to the development of 5 incredibly useful sub-theories. I'll mainly focus on competence and autonomy, which can be used to explain both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Usually people talk about relationships too, but as you might understand later, that aspect is somewhat absent from my analysis. This video essay will serve as an introduction to and analysis of these ideas in the context and the evolution of these games, so I'll develop the definitions of each term as we go on. Another point that I think is of note is that I played the NES versions of Dragon Warrior 1, 2, and 3, so if there are any discrepancies between what I mentioned and the content of the games that you are aware of, that's probably the reason for that. So, as you probably know, the Dragon Quest series focuses primarily on delivering a classic JRPG experience, and one of the first critically acclaimed open-world game series to do so. This is especially true in the trilogy that this video talks about, being that the trilogy is a huge inspiration for many of the most popular JRPGs such as Pokemon. Now, coming into this video, I expect you've played at least one of these 3 games. However, in the case you haven't, I'll give you some context about the structure of the first one. You're the hero Aleph, who you get to a new town, you buy better gear, you discover the next town through the village telling you about it, or its location, or any lore about it. You level up by beating the monsters that are close to the town, you fight each of them one by one, you enter the town again and heal up until you can handle them. When you've bought enough gear and gained enough experience points, you move to the next town and repeat this process until the game is finished. Now, under self-determination theory, there isn't much of a reason to justify this gameplay loop. The basic principles of the theory state that humans are inherently proactive and constantly want to grow. That's 2 out of the 3. The loop is one where the need for that growth and the inherent proactiveness is actually rewarded, creating a space where the player wants to act without feeling forced. With that need fulfilled, the player can then optimize the game by using the knowledge that they gain to their advantage, such as learning when it's best to go back to the closest town to heal so that they don't spend too much money. I would find it's very difficult to argue that this very basic and yet interesting gameplay loop does not fulfill the criteria of DSDT, which is what I'll be calling the theory from now on. You might also see that it's just not a very complex game. What is interesting though is the fact that you don't actually have to head to any of these towns, cities, or castles that the folk tell you about. You're actually allowed to go in any direction, granted that you survive the encounters with the monsters you encounter. You're just allowed to explore without much direction. And if you do want the direction, you actually have to go out of your way to find it. Thinking about it now, This leads very well into the idea of autonomy, which in the context of motivation, autonomy is the idea that the player feels free to act in accordance to their own will, no matter if this feeling is real or not, something which you might notice is very important and very common between these ideas. In a free space like the open world, the player is allowed to learn the mechanics and therefore develop strategic diversity. This diversity directly correlates with the feeling of autonomy and freedom the game is trying to instill in the player. This autonomy isn't real though, because the player isn't truly allowed to explore the world as they please. The open world and its extremely unforgiving nature, combined with the easily understood structure, becomes an environment where the player feels extremely competent. They are constantly challenged by new monsters that they can't yet easily defeat, but they know how to alleviate the difficulty due to their familiarity with the game's structure. Now, competence is the idea that the player needs to feel like they are capable beings that know how to function under the circumstances while still feeling challenged by them. If the player doesn't feel competent, they lose interest and therefore the motivation to keep participating. Yet again, the game has made you feel a necessary component to keep your attention and motivation to keep playing. As you keep participating, you get granulated and accumulative feedback, a mechanism that indicates competency. And as you keep participating in this process, since you level up, gain gold, attain items, discover new passageways, etc., you are being constantly given a stream of added bonuses as you complete every action in the game, be it intrinsically or extrinsically motivated. So, in this case, the intrinsic and extrinsic motivation are not actually that separated. The intrinsic motivation would be that the final boss be defeated and the princess be saved. However, the extrinsic motivation is directly connected to that goal, since it's exploration of the world, which would give you more levels. Finding a specific piece of armor because you think it sounds cool or it gives you a certain amount of damage, and that in that case one would be extrinsic and the other one would be intrinsic, and all of these motivations combine in a way that makes it so that the player feels motivated not only intrinsically but extrinsically. Dragon Quest II is the successor to Dragon Quest, and it improves the whole gameplay in a massive way. It significantly changes the core gameplay whilst maintaining the feeling of the first one. You now have more than one party member and significantly more enemies to fight at once. The user interface remains similar enough that you don't immediately feel like the experience is completely novel, maintaining the feeling of competency. Now, why would someone who's played Dragon Quest I want to play Dragon Quest II? The answer is honestly fairly simple. What motivates the player to finish Dragon Quest I does not disappear when the game is finished. The satisfying loop still leaves the player wanting more, even though that feeling might be less intense than it was at its peak. An intelligent designer and/or developer would know that that feeling would continue to become less and less intense if the player is presented with more gameplay that contains the same stimuli with no changes. The changes make it so that the challenge remains optimal. There's an actual progression to the challenge, and the player is forced to learn new solutions to new problems that, in this case, are created by new complexity. The player is made to stay within the bounds of competence, since by the time they finish the game, they feel just as familiar with the mechanics in Dragon Quest II than they did in Dragon Quest I. The way Dragon Quest II transitions the player into having more than one playable character is very intelligent. The game starts with the same structure as the first one, but you're immediately told that you need to seek your cousins as companions. While seeking them out, you actually use the same abilities you learned in the first game mechanically. You feel competent because you're rewarded with something useful at the end of that, which is your companions. Unlike in the first game, which when you save the princess, have to deliver her back to the king. If we look at it through the lens of theory, the game gives you a form of accumulated feedback, since after completing the first goal, you are given a reward, which is your first companion, Glyn, or the Prince of Cannock in most games. The reason why it falls within that structure is that the second quote-unquote mission also affords you a reward in the form of the Princess of Moodbrook, that I will call Alani. Now, I feel like it's important to say that these companions create a space where the player can feel more motivated since they have even more things that they have to learn how to manage, etc. Despite feeling like the game is open world in the first sequence, it really isn't. You are directly blocked by NPCs that you can't move past, and the lack of objects that you need to move within the world. The game locks you in a loop that you believe you're familiar with because of the first game. The great thing is that you still feel autonomous throughout the process because of multiple factors that create an illusion. You get to choose what locations you want to visit and explore, but in a very limited fashion. Just like the first game, you are told the story continues and yet are given free reign over the important choice of what to do next. The choice is significant since you can choose to try to ignore the presented path and advance before you're meant to, leading to either a level up or death. However, the player still needs to complete certain aspects before being able to actually pass to the next story. This solution also creates a context in which you feel competent while learning how to manage a new character mechanic, something which is clearly stated to help the player feel competent. The next reward is the bow, and right before you get it, the illusion of the open world starts to break. The bow allows you to cross the real map and increases the feeling of autonomy. Players are allowed to experience more mechanical and strategic diversity, since now you can go through the map that forced you to try different things. After the game becomes an open world game, it becomes just like the first one in the series, which is completely open and lets you do whatever you want, without the competency aspect disappearing, since there are still new things that the player has not completely learned to manage without any effort. There are a bunch of slight changes in the user interface from the first to the second game. Firstly, the stairs and door buttons disappear. Instead of stairs are automatically used anytime you're on a tile with a set, and you use key items to open doors. Dragon Quest II assumes you might find this problematic, so the very first room you find yourself in has a set of stairs to help you find the solution before you are even aware of the problem, making it so you learn how the system works faster. Now, the thing with the new user interface is that it allows you to streamline gameplay even further. Other than the stairs, you also find that when searching for treasure, you no longer have to search for it and then take it. The search button replaces both of those functions at the same time. Now, when the player has to equip an item, they go into the equip menu, which is separate from the item menu now. And this automation allows further optimization since it's a system you no longer need to address. As previously established, the player already knows how the mechanics work since the player frees the first game. This is a feeling of familiarity and therefore competency when trying out the sequels. The remote work in the exact same way throughout these games. The movement is simple with a grid where you can move in all four directions. The A button is to select and to open the menu. The B button deselects or turns back. All things that the player is already familiar with. Dragon Quest III uses the mechanics from both 1 and 2, and especially Dragon Quest II, to motivate the player in all those same ways that it did previously. The open world is still there, and all of the motivation applied to it is furthered because of the fact that there are more things to explore and more things to look for. There's a small town that you can improve throughout the gameplay that becomes bigger and bigger every time you collect a certain item, and the further you go through the story, the more you find things out, and the more things you find out, the more you are capable of working. So, in the conclusion, I want to introduce certain changes that I would do if I were to create the game to improve the motivation. First of all, there is a certain problem with output randomness that the game has. It creates fake depth, and in this case, the slightly random aspects of RPG calculations are not great because you never have full control over if you win or lose. This is more specific towards when enemies simply do not receive damage from any specific hits, because that is out of your control, and something being out of your control in this situation would not help you with your ability to feel competent and you're in control of the game. In Dragon Quest II, there's the area right before you get the boat, which is the only area you can go into after having played a certain amount, and that makes the world feel way smaller than it actually ends up being, which kind of breaks the sense of open worldness that the game has, breaking down the motivation that you've previously built